And there we go.
Mhm.
Um, all right. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Jenny, for joining from all the way in Canada and with with the time
Mhm.
difference. So thank you so
Mhm.
much. Um, just to briefly kind of introduce Jennifer, Jennifer Welchman is professor of philosophy at the University of Alberta, and her kind of research and teaching expertise is in ethics, a history of moral philosophy and environmental ethics, but also in aesthetics, especially film aesthetics, if I understand it well. Um, Jenny is also one of the founding directors of the Canadian Society for Environmental Philosophy and is currently working on a new project on aesthetic appreciation of nature's choreography and on the aesthetic qualities of dynamic performative aspect of nature and the natural world. But today we get a talk on the philosophy of film and fiction based on a true story, bullshit, lies, and docudramas. So please, Jenny, I'll leave it to you now.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. This is actually quite fun. Can you hear me all right? Hello?
Perfect. Yeah, I forgot you can't see
Oh,
us.
okay.
Yes.
Just checking.
We were
All
just
right.
thumbs up.
Okay. So thank you. So let me start. Docudramas are historical fiction films. Like all such films, they're set in the past. What distinguishes the members of this genre from their more purely fictive counterparts is that some real event or person is always central to the plot. When the focus is on a real person, docudramas are often called biopics. While all docudramas are subjects of suspicion and critique for their treatment of the past, none are more so than biopics, which film theorist Jim Welsh once provocatively characterized as a mendacious genre of movies that exist mainly to tell entertaining lies. The Imitation Game is one such film. It's loosely based upon the life of mathematician Alan Turing, focusing primarily on his contributions to British code breaking during the Second World War. Although the plot diverges so far from the truth as to have been described as, quote, as much of a garbled mess as a heap of unbroken code and, quote, a bizarre departure from the historical record, the film was not only popular, it was one of the most highly regarded dramatic films of 2014. It won an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. The voting members of the Academy apparently found no fault with the artistic license taken by the script. So who's correct? The Academy or its critics? If we go by audience reception, we should have to conclude it was not the critics. Take, for example, this film, Cool Runnings, a docudrama inspired by a Jamaican bobsled team competing at the 1988 Calgary Olympics. This film reflected reality in one and only one respect. A Jamaican bobsled team did compete at the 1988 Olympics. Most of the film's plot and all of its characters were invented, yet the film was a popular success. So too were Braveheart, Argo, Pearl Harbor, The Green Book, The Favorite, Bohemian Rhapsody, Death of Stalin, and many other films headlining internet lists of the most inaccurate historical films ever. So, what should we conclude? That audiences enjoy these films because they're too ignorant to recognize the inaccuracies they contain, or are inaccuracies only disfiguring for pedants and killjoys? On current accounts of how fiction works, no one willing to play the fiction game by its rules should be put off by divergences from historical reality. Fiction films, like fictions generally, are widely taken to be material for imaginative games, in which readers or viewers pretend they're reading or watching a report of events occurring in a make believe world as described by the narrative. Those descriptions determine what is supposed to be true in the make believe world or false. And according to the implicit rules of narrative films, we are to believe whatever we see depicted in a shot to be a faithful representation of things and events in the film's make believe world, barring any special declarations otherwise. So when the Imitation Game shows us images of actors Benedict Cumberbatch and Keira Knightley, shot in a West London movie studio in 2013. We know to make believe we are seeing Alan Turing and Joan Clark interacting at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire in 1941. On this understanding, it's entirely up to the game maker to decide what shall be true in the make-believe world. Take Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter. When its creators chose to depict Abraham Lincoln as a man beset by the undead, and who eventually wins the American Civil War by defeating an army of Confederate vampires, it became true in the make-believe world that Lincoln hunted vampires and false that he did not. Surprisingly, no reviewer has ever cited the film's historical inaccuracy as one of its aesthetic flaws. Should the Imitation Game be different? Well, Charles Bartel might reply it's different because, unlike the Imitation Game, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter really belongs to another genre, and that is fantasy. In the puzzle of historical criticism, he argues, it's just a brute fact about us that we're subject to two equally plausible but contradictory intuitions about historical fiction films. First, there's the intuition that historical inaccuracies in works of fiction diminish the value of some as works of fiction, and yet, given they are works of fiction, there's also an intuition that such works should be free from the constraints of historical truth. But he's not alone in this. Interestingly, even Peter Lamar, who has consistently opposed the idea that truth is an aesthetic virtue of works of fiction generally, has allowed it might be the case for certain genres, among which he includes historical fiction, of which he says departures from fact can seriously affect the overall achievement. Well, I disagree. And I'll be arguing that for the most part, the Imitation Game is absolutely no worse aesthetically for its lack of concern for historical truth. I say for the most part because there is one inaccuracy I find objectionable in it, and this one constitutes a special case because it's problematic morally, and not one that plausible moderate moralism such as Noel Carroll's can readily solve. But I'll say more about that in a moment. So first, let's round up some of the usual suspects regularly hauled in to justify complaints about historical inaccuracies in films. One is that they violate expectations of films of this genre. Another, that they violate an implicit contract with viewers, that the scenes depicted will correspond to reality unless it's made explicit they do not. And third, that we just resist imagining certain kinds of falsehoods can be true. Well, let's start with genre violations. On this approach, in order to evaluate a work of art, one must first identify the genre or category to which it belongs. And in order to, for example, evaluate a novel, one must know what features a novel is expected to have, features that distinguish it from short stories, poems, aphorisms, and so forth. And then in virtue of that, judge whether it meets those expectations well. Judging films works the same way. In order to evaluate a film, one must first consider the expectations definitive of the genre to which it belongs, and then evaluate its success or failure in realizing them. Now, what distinguishes the genre of docudramas? Well, they should be, first, fiction films. That means, two, they should be set in some earlier time period, and third, focused upon some real event or person. It's this last feature that distinguishes them from other historical films which feature no particular historical individuals or events at all, or where those only appear as part of a historical stage setting for an otherwise wholly fictional narrative. Now, if historical accuracy were widely agreed to be the fourth defining feature of the genre of docudramas, it would, like the first three I listed, also be a norm for the design of such films and for their aesthetic appreciation by audiences. Films violating these norms would disappoint audiences and be criticized accordingly. But what reason do we have to think this is what is actually expected of docudramas by audiences or filmmakers? The popular success of some I've mentioned is evidence that audiences do not consider historical accuracy to be a defining feature of this genre. And when filmmakers are asked for their views, it becomes evident that they see historical accuracy as a means rather than an end, the end being authenticity. Now, according to film director and theorist Dominic Lees, the reason, quote, the film crew's attention to historical detail is always used in publicity surrounding the production, and quote, is to establish the film's, quote, credibility in terms of period authenticity. What viewers expect of historical films generally is that the make-believe world of the film will seem authentic given what that audience believes about the period in which the film is set. And because these beliefs are based in part on how viewers have seen the same period represented in other films, the filmmaker must work with, quote, the spectator's cultural understanding of the past. To transgress too far would be to render the historical film inauthentic, end of quote. And it would do this even if the transgressions actually corrected viewers' mistaken impressions. Now, the creators of a 1996 documentary film, Haig, the Unknown Soldier, learned this the hard way when reviews in British newspapers discussed the film's interpretation of Haig's career in light of what they remembered from the 1980 satirical television series Blackadder. As film theorist Matthias Frey puts it, the aesthetic success of authenticity, and thus the mainstream historical film, is assessed via the following question: has the past been conveyed in a way that the spectator can reconcile with his or her perception of the historical reality? Audiences speak of films that bring history to life. I call this condition, this sensation of a media-produced, purportedly successful historicity, the authenticity feeling. Now, because authenticity is created by correspondence to expectations as much or more than correspondence to reality, a film can be authentic without being accurate, or accurate without seeming authentic. For an example of the latter, when Lees was making his 2016 film, The Burning, which was set in Tudor England, he wrote historically inaccurate dialogue he calls post-Shakespearean, but which is also in the trade known as bygoneese. He did this so that dialogue would not transgress viewers' expectations. And to ensure his male characters looked authentic, he put a number in wool beanies. You can see two of them in these in this shot, rather than the more historically accurate sort of floppy hats you see two other men wearing. Because if he dressed them all in the historically appropriate hats to contemporary audiences, they would, quote, appear like a parade of academics at a degree ceremony. So once one realizes that it's authenticity, not accuracy, that's expected of docudramas, one can appreciate how Graham Moore, the Imitation Game scriptwriter, could truthfully say, quote, historical accuracy was tremendously important to us, and every major event in the film did occur, end of quote, even though none of the events occurred as they were depicted, and many did not occur at all. Take, for example, the scene in which Joan Clark, who will later become Turing's colleague and fiancée, is shown earning her appointment to Bletchley Park. And I'm going to. All right. Yes, let me go forward. Okay. Now, the real Joan Clark was recruited directly from Cambridge because of her mathematical prowess. She was, in fact, recommended by her supervisor. But while the real Joan Clark wasn't recruited in the way the film supposes, the supposition that she might have been is not implausible and wouldn't have been to audiences, especially in Britain, as later in the war, it was well known that puzzles were used to identify potentially useful prospects among civil service applicants. For audiences watching Joan Clark score a victory over sneering male peers is far more dramatically appealing than it would be to see her receive a letter offering her a job interview. And moreover, it has the aesthetic virtue of making the misogyny Joan Clark faces seem authentic to viewers. Personally, I think the scene is well and cleverly done, and that what it supposes didn't actually occur seems to me aesthetically irrelevant. So to sum up, films like The Imitation Game can't violate genre expectations of docudramas because with what the exceptions I've mentioned, the first three, there are no expectations of historical accuracy. The one exception is that the persons and events around which their narratives revolve must have existed. Well, unlike documentaries, which make factual assertions about their subjects, Docudramas are merely suppositions about how their subjects might possibly have felt or acted. And consequently, creators of docudramas don't lie. They don't deliberately mislead. They don't even make historical errors. Really, they just bullshit in the philosophically accepted sense of the term. They do not care whether their films correspond to reality or even whether viewers believe that they do. Did the makers of Imitation Game believe that Turing was on the autism spectrum? No. Did they care whether audiences believed he was? Not really. All that mattered was that it was not implausible to suppose he might have been, and supposing he was, helped Cumberbatch play the role effectively. Now, some filmmakers provide title cards at the beginning or end of their films to remind viewers that what is depicted is just how events might have played out. But in many instances, the only signal provided is through advertising describing the film as, quote, based on a true story, end of quote. Now, surely this should be warning enough, for clearly any film based on a true story isn't going to be identical to the story on which it's based. Necessarily, it will depart from reality. Iskra Fileva has proposed that we might think of historical accuracy as, quote, a fiction author's analog to a supererogatory action, something to be praised when present, but not something obligatory. I lean to this view myself, yet she thinks it can't be the whole truth about legitimate expectations of historical films, because she agrees with Bartel that, quote, we can't help but intuit that criticisms of the inaccuracy of certain works are justified. Now, Fileva explains this not by appeal to genre expectations, but by appeal to what she calls a conversational contract between creators and audiences, one which implies that, quote, historical inaccuracy is permitted when used imaginatively in the service of artistic goals more important than accuracy, end of quote. She thinks historical inaccuracies violate this contract when they're either the result of sloppy scholarship, so unbelievable that they are not likely to serve an artistic aim, or, quote, not artistic, but self-serving or propagandistic. Since I think it's on the basis of authenticity rather than accuracy that we evaluate historical fictions, I can't see any basis for supposing such an implicit contract exists. That said, I share her concern that some kinds of historical inaccuracies could be problematic. And I'm going to show you another brief clip from Imitation Game that does conclude what I consider a problematic supposition, a scene in which the head of Bletchley Park's code-breaking operations, Commander Alistair Denniston, insults Turing and attempts to fire him and okay, are you able to see this? Is it being, it's not being shared, is it? Let me get it shared. Okay. Okay, to set you up, you will see Denniston with minions complaining. Then we'll go off and see what Turing is up to, and then we'll see a conflict between them. Okay. So I think we're back in business. All right, so the scene you just saw never happened. The scriptwriter merely supposed it in order to inject dramatic tension into the plot, reasoning that such altercations might have arisen as the natural result of, quote, people working extremely hard under imaginable pressure, end of quote. So what's my problem with this scene? It's the distress it caused Denniston's surviving family members. You see, the real Alistair Denniston never bullied or threatened Turing. So even though no one curls a lip better than actor Charles Dance, I can't enjoy this scene. I can't enjoy it because I can't help thinking of Denniston's family, for whom the mere supposition that he would ever behave such a way is anathema. Now, it's not anathema for me to suppose it. I can easily do so. So my objection to the scene can't be explained by what Tamara Gendler has labeled audiences' imaginative resistance to believing some falsehoods to be true within a fictional world. Gendler argues that while we're willing to make believe many falsehoods that fiction suggests to us, we resist suggestions that we make believe egregious moral falsehoods are actually true within a fictional world. So, for example, we're not unwilling to make believe that a character in a fiction holds morally objectionable beliefs. For example, that infanticide is morally justified if the infant is a girl. But we would resist making believe it's right and proper for everyone in that fictional world to behave that way. And whenever audiences cannot help, just move that out of the way, resisting in this way, their appreciation of the fictional world will be diminished. Now, the burgeoning literature on imaginative resistance has since identified other elements in fictional worlds that can trigger a similar response, many unrelated to a requirement to accept, albeit temporarily, egregiously immoral beliefs. It appears that simply being asked to believe something unimaginable or incoherent can also trigger imaginative resistance. Now, as Deniston's surviving family or friends presumably found it unimaginable that he could ever have behaved as Charles Dance does in the film, it would be this latter sort of imaginative resistance they would be experiencing. However, it doesn't explain mine. First, as I've already indicated, I don't suppose fiction films ask me to believe anything is true or false. They merely ask me to suppose some things might be true. Second, nothing in the imagination game is beyond my imagining. The problem instead is that whenever Dance as Deniston enters a scene and starts haranguing Turing, as often happens, my engagement with the film is disrupted by my astonishment at the filmmaker's unnecessary cruelty to Deniston's family. I'm momentarily too distracted to carry on playing the film's make-believe game. What makes it seem so cruel is that the filmmakers were well aware that including negative portrayals of characters bearing the names of real people was liable to distress surviving friends and relatives of the real people whose names were being used. And for example, they stated that it was for just this reason that they did not use the real name of the policeman who interrogates Turing after his arrest, which triggers the flashbacks that make up the bulk of the movie. Though Deniston had died decades earlier, family members who knew him were still amongst us and were deeply distressed by his villainization by filmmakers. So as I see it, the depiction of Deniston constitutes a moral wrong. And my dismay at this is what disrupts my aesthetic engagement with the film whenever I'm asked to believe he bullied Turing. And because my engagement with the film is disrupted, I would have thought that this moral defect is also an aesthetic one. But on what has always seemed to be, to me, the most plausible theory of the relation of moral and aesthetic value, Noel Carroll's moderate moralism, this can't be the case. Moderate moralists accept that some moral vices can diminish a work's aesthetic value. Carroll, who gave it its moderate moralism its name, argues that to realize artistic objectives of narrative representational artworks, artists must often aim to mobilize their audience's emotions, some of which are moral emotions. But if a work fails to mobilize an audience's emotions or fails to mobilize the right ones, the effect can be so jarring as to distort or diminish its aesthetic effects. And in these kinds of cases, a moral defect is also an aesthetic defect. However, this isn't the problem I'm having with the Imitation Game. If I were supposed to form a positive attitude overall towards the villainous Deniston, despite his mistreatment of Turing, well, then the filmmakers would be guilty of the sort of error Carroll describes. The filmmaker's flawed moral understanding, as embodied in the work, would be a moral defect that gives rise to an aesthetic defect. That's not what's going on here. The filmmakers clearly want me to loathe and despise the villainous Deniston, whose personality and behaviors, played by Dance, ensure that such attitudes are entirely fitting. So I'm not being asked to feel inappropriate moral notions towards a key character. When I wonder to myself, how can they be so cruel? I'm responding to the filmmakers, not the film's characters. And I am, through no fault of my own, forced out of my previous state of immersion in the make-believe world by this unfortunate feature of its composition. Now, a moderate moralist might reply here that my objection is misdirected. Only moral failings internal to an artwork can make it aesthetically defective. Defects in the character of the artist who made it are external to it and so irrelevant to its aesthetic merits. Roald Dahl was an anti-Semite, but his children's books remain charming. So arguably, The Imitation Game is neither morally nor aesthetically problematic, just because the filmmakers making it were egregiously insensitive. However, the morally problematic use of Deniston's name is not just a fact revealing something untoward about the filmmaker's characters. It's a constituent element of the film, and one so jarring it inevitably disrupts my appreciation of it. And since to be aesthetically jarring is an aesthetic defect, I think the morally defective composition of the scenes in which dance appears as Deniston is defective as well. I'm not claiming the defect is devastating to the film as a whole. The performance and production values are too good for that. What it does suggest to me, though, is that we need to look beyond standard forms of moderate moralism to cover such cases. We must be able to recognize a wider range of moral flaws as aesthetic defeaters, to use Aaron Smuts' term, which can potentially diminish good-making qualities of artworks. And we have to find a way to do this without licensing filmgoers to judge any sort of offense a film may happen to cause as a moral defect which diminishes the film's quality. So here's a suggestion that might cover this case. There's another social contract that seems relevant here, one that underlies ordinary product liability. Producers distributing products to consumers are bound to ensure their products not cause foreseeable and avoidable harm to consumers. The filmmakers knew their product would be directly harmful to at least one group of living viewers and took no steps to prevent or mitigate it. This is the moral wrong, one which has a capacity to disrupt the aesthetic engagement of those who recognize it. Now, one might worry this strategy could create yet another basis for accepting the intuition that historical inaccuracies do diminish the aesthetic value of the fictions in which they occur, because we know a percentage of viewers of docudramas will accept what these films depict as largely true, even when the previews and posters clearly state they're merely based on true events. So shouldn't filmmakers prevent or mitigate this avoidable harm of suffering false beliefs by removing inaccuracies from their films? Failure to take action could become a source then of aesthetic disruption for viewers who are aware of the potential for this effect on fellow audience members. Well, there are ways to diminish the likelihood of viewers being seriously misled. Title cards at the end of films, for example, could advise audiences that the film is not offered as a complete and accurate history, but merely a supposition of how events might have occurred. Personally, I would applaud such choices, though I view them as supererogatory on the part of filmmakers. In the end, as far as I see it, any harm experienced merely because of historical inaccuracies is self-inflicted when normal audience members who are adults and who know the rules of the historical fiction game refuse to play by the rules. Thank you.